So we're going to go straight into our next keynote now, and I'm really pleased to welcome to the stage Keith Conradi from Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch, an organization very new, but just beginning to make some real transformative recommendations and changes, I believe. So everybody, if you could welcome to the stage Keith Conradi from HSIB.
Could you get me a drink, please?
Whichever you...
Thanks. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about HSIB and where we're at. So we are now just over a year old, and just to remind you that here we have, that's what we're aiming to achieve. So we've been set up, and we are there to try and improve patient safety through these investigations. So far we've done 18 investigations. We've pulled back on 3, and I'll talk more about that in a second. We're there to determine the causes, to make safety recommendations, safety action, and safety observations. And I'll talk through particularly the 2 investigations reports that we've released to date. So I was asked today to go through the key learning points from the first year of the investigation, what we're hoping to achieve in year 2, and also perhaps how our reports and the way we do our investigations could help raise standards in your own organization in terms of investigations. So what have we learned in year 1? I think more than anything else, we've learned how difficult and frightening it is if you find yourself under investigation. Now, there are a whole bunch of investigations I know take place in this sector, and we are just adding onto that list. And we spend a great deal of our time before we actually move into a trust to actually talk through exactly what we are trying to achieve, to give some reassurance to those that we are going to be interviewing and talking to. And perhaps there's an education element in what we are doing. And I spend a lot of time, one of the key things we do before we start is that I will try and have a phone call with the chief exec of the trust that we are going into. And invariably, and I think I've said this before, I characterize their response as defensive curiosity. And they've rarely heard of us or kind of heard us in the background of what's this investigation group. There is this element of fear. And we just take the time to explain that in fact we are not there to apportion any blame. We are there absolutely to get the most safety learning from this event that we possibly can. And that was brought home to me in a quote from one of the clinicians that we interviewed who said, "Thank you, for the first time in weeks I have had a proper night's sleep now that you've talked to me," and he's been able to actually unload everything that he had on his mind. And I'd like to think that we'll have more of that in the future. The other big thing that has come out of this first year is the way we've used subject matter experts. We have our own investigators who are expert in investigating, but I'd like to say that really is the core of what we do. And then we bring in subject matter experts to help us understand the specific problem. And I thought, perhaps naively, that actually we'd be using people who really had the fine detail on the particular procedure or process we were looking at. But probably in half the investigations we've done to date, we've actually introduced new human factors experts, and I mean new, not the ones that we have in the organization, to assist us with different types of human performance, understanding context, environment, the use of equipment. And I think they've been very powerful, and I think that comes out particularly in the first report, which I'll come on to in a sec. So I definitely see us using more of that. And as we increase, or if we recruit new investigators, and we are on that process at the moment, I see having that human factors, human performance skill as being a key part of what we're looking for. So we've released 2 reports to date. The first one was a few weeks ago, and it was on a wrong prosthesis implant. I'm really proud of this report. I think our investigators did a fabulous job. There was huge engagement with the patient. The patient was very happy to be named and played a major part in the investigation. And there was also a great deal of contact with the staff that were involved. and just about everybody gave us a great deal of information that helped us to understand not just what happened, but the reasons behind it, and then we were able to open it up more widely. So the event was effectively that it was a whole hip replacement, and there were two incompatible parts. They were from different manufacturers, were put in together, which is a never event. The things we looked at, and I commend you to read the report, but we found a huge variation in the verification process. So in this particular case, a nurse went out to collect the parts from the storeroom and came back with the two incompatible parts. That's going to happen. But then we looked at, okay, why was that not picked up in the verification? And the variety, the variation we saw between this and many other trusts that we looked at was absolutely fascinating. We document all these in the report. We looked at the fact that they use a laminated sheet to help them remember the part that they need or the parts that they need to go and get. And this was interesting because the laminated sheet contained a great deal of information, but didn't include the manufacturer, which was the one piece that actually was in error here. We went into fatigue. We talked to the nurse who had brought the incompatible parts and worked out actually she'd been pretty tired. She'd worked a lot of overtime. She'd been away on a course. She hadn't slept well away from home. And it's really gratifying that she felt able to share that with us. I should add, though, on fatigue, this was the very first procedure of the day. So actually the rest of the team felt that they weren't tired. So again, we're asking the question, why wasn't the fact that these parts were incompatible picked up by the rest of the team? So we looked at the environment. We looked at the noise, the laminar flow. We even actually had an interesting sort of piece on the music that was played, actually the pros and cons of doing that. We looked at the difficulties in vision across a pretty busy theatre, and the things that get in the way, the things that impede, and the fact that the nurse was holding up these parts for verification. The other side of the laminar flow area, actually then people are looking at it through visors. Actually, we looked at the lighting that took place there, just how difficult it was to make a really good check that you have the right pieces. The differences in packaging, so we made recommendations regarding font size, and that was interesting in its own right. And actually, the amount of choice that people have when they go out to get to different parts. And we talked to some trusts who've deliberately tried to reduce the amount of choice available, and we're quite curious to know, actually, does that have an impact on the errors that are made? And then we went overseas. So we do comparison visits with other trusts within England, but this time we decided to go to Denmark and have a look at how they do the same process. And it was interesting. The reason we chose Denmark is because they actually scan the parts before they actually implant them into the person. And we made recommendations regarding that as well. And I think what was interesting for me is that we did do a snapshot of previous events. So we looked at a 6-month period where there were 18 of these events investigated locally at trust level. And the root cause of all of those was checking process not followed. And I think what we are able to add is to go further, to go beyond that, and to really understand why the checking process wasn't followed. This is a photo from the report itself, and it's just some way we're trying to explain, this is what it looks like, and these are the practical working conditions that people are trying to make some of these decisions based on. And then this morning, we released our second report. This was quite a different report, investigating the transition from child and adolescent mental health services to adult mental health services. It followed a really tragic suicide of a young person that happened right on this transition phase. And again, we found out that this was symptomatic of similar events across the country. And we've made several recommendations, most of them to NHS England, regarding a much more flexible transition. So it isn't this rigid 18, which takes place in a large part of the country. And how can we make that transition process smoother? How can we ensure that there are conversations so that people are ready to move from one service to the other? And I think one of the most moving parts of this is that we put together a focus group of young people who had just gone through transition or were going through it, and took a lot of their comments, and they're included in the report, just how frightening they found this change from one service to the other. They talk about this sort of warm environment with music and posters on the wall and sweets, and very open access to the care coordinators in the child world. And then really almost overnight, you hit 18 and you go into this very different world, controlled access, talking through glass screens, in waiting rooms with people obviously who are much, much older than them, a lot of acute sickness in there. And I think to a person they said it was absolutely terrifying experience. And a lot of these have got other issues like autism spectrum disorder, which make the whole process very challenging indeed. And there's a great quote from one of our subject matter experts really here. So, when young people are at the peak of their physical power, they are psychologically the most vulnerable. And to add to that, the system is probably at its weakest. So I'd like to think some of the safety recommendations we are making will help improve that whole situation. And when I talk about safety recommendations, these won't ever come as a surprise to the addressee. We are working during the investigation with the potential addressees to help refine and make sure that we get a safety recommendation which actually is practical and is likely to be taken up. So, objectives for year 2. Maternity, you may have heard we have to have a whole bunch of maternity investigations. I won't say very much about this because actually Sandy Lewis is one of our investigators who is now leading the maternity program for us, and she is going to be talking later on at the Congress. Suffice to say, we are looking for national coverage doing maternity investigations, and we've recruited so far 70 investigators. We're looking for, I think, 120, 130 by the time we complete the program next March. Recommendations. I put this up because this has been a big learning curve for us, actually, who to make recommendations to. It's one of the biggest differences I've found coming from my previous world in transport is the amount of regulators there are here. Actually, where is the overlap? Where potentially are the gaps between regulation? And also something, if I take the example where we wanted to change make a recommendation about the font size on packaging. You think, well, who do we make that to? And we thought about it. We thought, well, maybe the MHRA would be the appropriate people. But actually, when we talk to them, we find out actually they are very much governed by EU regulation on these sorts of things. And actually, they then pointed us to the British Standards Institute. And in fact, that's where we ended up making the recommendation. And we have other examples with procurement. Who do we actually go and make the recommendation to? So I think that's quite a learning curve for us, which will hopefully will continue into next year. And talking of recommendations, when we make a recommendation, we ask that the addressee responds within 90 days, which is sort of a normal standard in the transport world. And we'll make that response public. But we're also thinking of actually to try and really bind these recommendations or bound them. We want to also, in that response from the addressee, say how long it will take for that recommendation action to take, so that actually they can then be held to account by actually, has this happened at this particular time? So that's something that we're working on for the future. And then you may have heard that there's some draft legislation that Parliament are currently scrutinising. This legislation will turn HSIB, if it goes through, into a much more independent arm's-length body of some sort or the other. It will give us significant powers to take evidence, take information, take statements, and protect that information. And potentially, as well as the way it's currently written, it will allow us to accredit other investigators from trusts to do their own investigations. So a joint committee has currently been taking evidence over this and will produce their report on any changes to that draft that they think are needed. They'll produce that report by the 24th of July. And then, as I understand it, the government has 2 months to respond to that. And then we should get to take that into the next session of legislation and be competing with all the other bits of legislation. So perhaps, if it all goes through, we're talking a couple of years, we may find ourselves as a fully independent arm's-length body. We wait and see. So the third part that I was asked to look about was actually how could our reports be of benefit to your organizations. The first thing I'd say was, okay, they're long reports, and I would really commend that you do read the whole report, but being practical about this whole thing, for every report that we publish, we will also produce a summary report, which will just be a few pages long. So please, if nothing else, read the summary. These will include all the findings, and in the reports that we've released to date, there are about, 10, 15 findings, so it's not too onerous. They will include the safety recommendations, and when we make these, they will have a specific addressee on them, and you can see exactly where we're going with these. And we've also included safety observations. So these are areas where we don't feel we have enough evidence to make a full safety recommendation, but it's a kind of a marker that we'd like to put down. Look, we've seen this. It's not perhaps a full part of this particular investigation, but we want to acknowledge the fact that we've seen this issue, and we will use it, actually, if we see the same thing in several reports. It could produce enough evidence that we have actually start an investigation onto that issue by itself in the future. So I would ask you that you do that. Most of our safety recommendations, if not all, will be to national bodies. So they won't be to the individual trust, but as an individual trust, you might want to look at what we're recommending and see if you could introduce some of those ideas into your own trust. If I take the example of the verification process in the first report, we've recommended that NHS Improvement, they amend their current guidance to include the findings that we had on verification process. And I know some trusts have already said, hey, let's see what you've written in there, let's see what is good practice, and let's see if we can incorporate those ahead of the guidance coming out from NHS Improvement. So that's something that potentially you could do. And then thirdly, perhaps just look at the report, consider the way we've investigated, what we put in it, even the way we write these reports, and see if within your own investigations you are able to perhaps model some of that, if you would find that useful. The way actually we take it away from a person, we move to the system problem. And I know there are limits to what you can do at a local level, but just look at it. I mean, one of the small things that we do is we try and be, dare I say, dispassionate in our reporting. And one of the ways you can do that is by looking at every adjective in there and going, actually, is this necessary? Is this adding anything? And what does it actually mean? And so we tend to strip most of the adjectives out of the reports that we do. I say I'm very proud of the first two reports that we've published. We had some great feedback from the first one. The second one, I guess, is slightly too early. It's only 10 hours old. I like these quotes from Suzette Woodward, Sign Up for Safety, talking about the way that we've done the reporting. And as she says, I think we've set a really high bar. That's exactly where I'd like to be. And we will look to achieve that bar for every report that we do. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. I always enjoy the opportunity of having a chat with you, as you know. And we've been doggedly having conversations since HSIB was just an idea on someone's committee list, I think. But I wanted to take the opportunity now to talk to you about your first few reports and to drill down into the benefit of those for the audience and for organizations. And it struck me reading the first one around the surgical error, that is the kind of error that trusts will see often, or it happens, and they will be having to do their own investigation. And having read the report, what struck me was that the way the report was structured and what you actually did, including, I think, visiting theatres in Denmark, and as you said, going into vision and sound and all of these things, a trust doing a normal serious incident investigation wouldn't have been able to do that level of work. So is that the secret sauce success for HSIB, that you can go to a level that the NHS hasn't been able to before?
Well, I mean, I think we'd be wasting the opportunity if we didn't do that. You know, we have full-time investigators. This is what we do. We don't have a day job. This is the day job. And so we should be able to take it to another level. I completely understand at trust level there's no way that you're ever going to be able to do this. But if we can take that issue and really dig as deep as we can and come up with the findings that I think we demonstrated in that first one, then I think we can make a difference. But it does come back, as I was saying there at the end, that actually at trust level there is an opportunity to see what we've read, what we've written, and potentially introduce that as good practice into your own processes.
And that report, I don't know how many people in the room have read that report, but one of the key recommendations is to introduce effectively barcode scanning system actually in situ in the operating theatre that will effectively flash red or whatever to alert people that you have the wrong prosthesis for this operation for this patient. And you talked about the process checking system that people go through. Isn't introducing a barcode scan, isn't that just another process? And actually you need staff in the operating theatre to still do that, and they may not do that, even if a system is in place. And
yeah, I mean, nothing is absolutely foolproof. All we're trying to do is just reduce that risk as much as we possibly can. And as you can see, the processes, there's some pretty extensive verification process that takes place, but it isn't foolproof. Introducing a technical solution like that, I think, will just assist in getting closer to, no faults at all. But I think the reality is, yes, there is always going to be some problems.
And I know HSIB obviously want to look at the systemic causes of error, and you mentioned that you looked at fatigue of the nurse, and I know that your investigator felt that it wasn't, in the end, a contributory causal factor in the actual incident. But no doubt you will, I suspect, come across that issue and others like it, and safe staffing levels, workforce shortages, burnout among doctors, etc. How likely is it, do you think, that HSIB will start perhaps making recommendations around staff shortages and overwork and workload on staff, that sort of big ticket issues that people often complain about and is in the background of all systemic incidents and issues that go on? Those kind of things are featured in mid-staffs and Gosport and Morecambe Bay, etc., but nobody ever really grabs hold of them and deals with them. Do you think HSIB could start causing some trouble for the system regulators by making those kinds of recommendations? I think we're all rooting for you, by the way.
Yeah, and I mean, we're not out there to cause trouble, but we're out there to go where the evidence takes us. So if the evidence points in that direction, absolutely. But I think this was an interesting one because, yes, that particular person, I think, was pretty fatigued. But we try and balance that out by saying, actually, the rest of the team were not. And so we don't just want to jump on a bandwagon which says, fatigue, that must have been the cause of this. So it does need good evidence. We did make an observation in that report saying that actually fatigue and those sorts of factors should be included in the information that's given to the STICE and NRLS databases, so that actually we start to build a picture of actually how much is this a real problem. And like I was saying, the safety observations, having put a marker out there that actually there's something that we are interested in, if we start to see that in several investigations, we may decide to take it on as a theme in its own right. But we do need the evidence before we do that. Yeah.
Your report that you've published today, which there is a story on the Health Service Journal website, there's my plug for the HSJ. You talk about the CAMS services, and particularly there's a recommendation for NHS England on ensuring that they somehow require CCGs to effectively evidence that they're spending the money they said they would spend, that they have spent it. NHS England hasn't reacted particularly well when the CQC has tried to tell it how it should do certain things in relation to mental health. how confident are you that NHS England, or in fact other bodies, will take the recommendations from HSIB seriously and act on them? Because at the moment there's no actual requirement that they do so.
No, there isn't, but one of the things we really want to do, and we have been doing on these, is to work closely with, in fact, in this case, NHS England. So as we are seeing the evidence that we're collecting is kind of coming into the investigation, we've been working with them and saying, hey, this is what we're seeing. What do you think? You know, what are you proposing to do about? Which gives them the opportunity to potentially be proactive and come up with a safety action. But actually, in this case, they are keen to do something. They almost need the push from a body such as ourselves, a national voice saying, you need to do this. But we were pushing at an open door with all those recommendations to NHS England that actually they want that, if you like, ammunition to be able to then go and do actually what they do want them to do themselves anyway.
Okay, I suspect you know this question was coming. But we talk about it every time we meet. But safe space.
Oh.
There's a whole debate about this, and there's one side that believes it's going to lead to cover-up, it's going to deny families information about incidents that happen to them, and safe space extended to local trusts could make it easier for trusts to actually victimise staff that speak up. Where are you on this debate with safe space now? And can you explain and reassure to the audience about what exactly is meant by this?
I think the problem is that when people hear safe space, they think that people will give us information and that information will never see the light of day. And that would be pretty pointless as far as we're concerned. So the information that is candidly given to us under that environment will be used in the report. There would be no point in taking that information if we didn't use it. So we will use it in the report. And we will use that in conjunction with all the other information that is given to us and from all the different sources to build up the picture as we see it as to what happened and the underlying causes behind it. It is a powerful tool. I think there is the potential for it to be abused if it isn't handled very carefully. And I do have concerns that if it is, that power is delegated to other people, the further it gets away from us, the more damaging that could happen, that could be if people, perhaps not deliberately, but it could be deliberately or inadvertently abuse that power. So I'm very uncomfortable with it extending beyond HSIB itself.
Okay, interesting. Well, sadly we've run out of time, but I hope people in the audience found that useful. I would urge you as well to read the first report that HSIB put out. I actually found it very different to the usual incident investigation report, so I encourage anyone that's interested to read that. Keith, thank you for your time this morning. I really appreciate it.